Good. I messed up a couple of things last time I was streaming, so I just want to make sure I can do a better job of it this time. Like, I forgot to actually turn on the Instagram streaming, and it looks like I'm on Instagram now, so that's good news. Cool. The topic today is going to be startups versus big tech, and my goal here is not to persuade you or make you think that I'm trying to tell you one of them is superior to the other or anything like that. That's going to be the topic of discussion. I do have a better view of the chat this time, so I should be able to see messages and stuff coming in. So I do really like for these to be interactive. So by all means, if you have questions, even if it's not about the topic and you want them answered, just drop them in the chat. Happy to answer. The whole point is that I want this to be interactive, right? So uh, I want to be able to help share some of my experiences, and hopefully they help you. So with that said, when we talk about, I mean, anything really, but in particular, when I'm going to start kind of comparing and contrasting startups and big tech, I want to make sure I can talk about bias first of all, because I think it's important to understand that everything we start to analyze, like add pros and cons to, there's going to be some amount of bias. Like any person who's explaining whatever perspective is going to have bias. So I want to start with that so that as I'm navigating some of these concepts and explaining them, answering questions, whatever it happens to be, that you understand what my biases are, right? And as much as possible, I want to be aware of those when I'm explaining things, but I think it's important to draw attention to bias. So, I think it's important to mention that I spent my internships in university at small companies slash startups. So some of my earliest experiences working in industry were at very small companies or startups. That shaped a lot of my perception of working as a software engineer. So I think that's important to acknowledge. I do think that I spent time. The largest part of my career was at a small company, very much a startup that grew to, hundreds of people. So I got to experience startup growth. I got to go through those early days of it being, I don't want to say a struggle, and that's another bias I'll mention in a second. It wasn't necessarily a struggle, but it was a ton of work, right? So we have to factor in those things. And the other thing that I'll mention is, of course, right now I'm at Microsoft. So there's some bias there. Like I haven't worked at all of the big tech companies. Microsoft is one such big tech company. So there's some bias with that, right? The other bias I wanted to mention about risk, I kind of briefly hinted at it, but I've worked at small companies and startups, but I don't feel like any of them was necessarily risky. And that's an important factor, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is risk. But my bias from my own experiences has been that I did not work at startups where it felt like, oh crap, like this is risky. Like, what am I giving up to be part of this startup? In fact, I worked at startups that were, by people who were either not, I don't want to say necessarily like serial entrepreneurs, like somewhat, some of them actually, yes. But they could have been startups that had, they were already profitable because they had, paying customers without investment, bootstrapped by serial entrepreneurs, the kind of thing where I don't feel like I'm taking a huge risk to be part of that startup. So that's some of my bias going into this. Hello on YouTube. Thanks for the comments. So with all of that said, I want to, I mean, and I'll try to identify bias as I'm going through this because there might be some topics as we get into them. I'll go, oh crap, like I do have a bit of bias towards that. So I will try to be accountable if I can. The whole reason that I'm talking about startups and big tech, a couple reasons, I guess. One of them is in a recent newsletter. I mentioned this when it comes to job searching. But another reason is because this is something that's been asked of me. Like when people are looking for jobs and things like that, they're starting to ask, like, well, what is it like at a startup? Right? Like, should I be doing that? What's your experience doing that? Because I think people are trying to do a bit of investigation or modeling, right? They're trying to say, like, if I'm trying to get into industry, like, what should I be doing? And we all know, like, right now, the tech job market, and I'm sure other job markets are very challenging. So it's it's really, what's a good way to put this? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. The With the job markets being so tough right now and people trying to think about like where the best way to start is, it's like it's really challenging for me to say like, yeah, sure, like here's what I did, you should just do the same thing. I think that's what I was getting stuck on. Is like when it comes to advice, and this is why the bias part is so important, it's really difficult to just say here's what I did, therefore follow it. I need to kind of step back and try to offer a bit something a little bit more generalized with the caveat of the bias attached to it. There's a good question in the chat too. Um, Maybe I'll answer this at sort of at the beginning because it's right here and I think it's pretty good. But so after being at Microsoft, did you ever think about going back to any startup? So this is a good question. And again, if I back up from like Microsoft in particular, just thinking about the experiences of big tech versus startups, um, I'm very much the kind of person where, like, for a startup, after having gone through it from a very small company. So the startup that I work for is a company. It's a digital forensics company called Magnet Forensics, and I was there not at the very first day, but like basically right at the beginning of them starting an engineering team. And I know what went into that company from the development side from the beginning to get to where they are today. Like I can say that very confidently because I lived it. And I don't think this is sort of a requirement for any startup, but I can remember working like a ridiculous amount, not because they made me at all, but I can remember the amount of time and energy that had to go into that to be able to kind of, I feel like, put it on the trajectory that it needed, at least from the development side. I'm not trying to claim responsibility for all of the development or all of the sales and marketing, nothing like that. But I saw what went into that, and I wasn't the only person kind of putting in like everything. So the question, would I go back to any startup? Um, I don't know. I think at some point in my career, I would like to have a software company. That's sort of a long term goal of mine. That excites me. I don't know when that is. So, like, if someone from Microsoft is watching, it's not like I'm planning to leave. Like, not the case at all. Um, I think that's something that I want in my life. I think that would be very cool. But I think if I go to a startup, I think it needs to be my own. And the reason I say that is because I don't know how old I was, like 23 till like 30, 31, whatever the time frame was I was at Magnet Forensics. I I This is gonna sound like an exaggeration, but I kind of mean it. Like I basically gave up that part of my life. I almost didn't do anything else for those 8 years. Again, no one made me do that. That's just kind of how I was. But I gave up that time. I literally basically just went to work, ate, went to the gym, and slept for like 8 years. So I think if I were to do a startup, it would need to be my own for me to put the energy that I'd want to into that. Because I think I'm 35 now. I don't think I have the energy to dedicate to someone else's startup at this point. So for the added context here, and thank you. Context is incredibly important for right. So for context, the only company I worked ever is Microsoft. I always wanted to try a startup, a risk factor. Yeah. So I think it's funny. I wrote some notes down. Risk is after my intro on bias. Risk is the first one that I wanted to talk about, and I needed to lead with the bias first because I never was in a situation where the startups where I was at felt like risk. Now, arguably, any company has risk. Like everything has risk that we do, right? And I think even more so if we rewind a few years, I would say that probably people perceived startups as being the riskier thing to do, of course, right? Small company, just starting up. Maybe people haven't done this before. A lot more risk. In big companies, they've been around for years, so like a lot less risk of them failing, right? Because something pretty dramatic would have to happen. But I think the other thing that's important is that probably the assumption about job market stability. That was probably a big factor. And I don't want to like dwell on this. Just think it's an important point. I understand that timing for jobs and like sort of the whole tech scene is very challenging right now. So it's not my intention to, I don't know, to gloss over it or to minimize it, because I do think it's incredibly impactful at this moment. But I think probably people used to, maybe not so much now, I don't know, but maybe people used to say, oh, big tech, like I get my good salary, I get good benefits, I get stock options, and it's stable, it's secure. Like once I'm in, no worries. And I guess I don't know if people always had that perception, but I think probably a lot of people leaned into that a lot. And I think probably because for the most part, like the companies are more stable. They don't have to go through it's not like bad product launch and the whole company goes under or something, because they're so diverse, like big tech companies, right? So diverse in their offerings. But I think that narrative's changing a little bit. And I think when people see the mass layoffs and stuff like that, and they see the instability in general in the job market, um, I think some people start to question like is and I'm not like Microsoft is the example here, and I work there, right? So it's not Microsoft specific. This is generally in big tech. Is it really as stable as people might have thought? I don't know. I'm not part of like layoff decisions and things like that. So I don't mean to, I'm not trying to speak from like a position of authority on it, but I do think that that's maybe a different type of consideration that comes into the mix when we talk about startups and big tech. It used to seem very much more like stability in big tech. Maybe not now. But I do still think from the startup perspective, I don't think it's changed that you could potentially be looking at a company that has a significant amount of risk. So I'm not an expert on this. I've worked at a few startups, and this was at the earliest times of my career. So again, some of the bias there is like I've never done this as like a more mature adult. I have over a decade of experience now in the industry, and I've learned a whole bunch. And I think at the time when I was navigating, hey, like especially my internships, like what would be a good startup to go work at for an internship? Part of the thing at that point was like, it's an internship. It's 4 months. Like company should probably last 4 months. Like, not a whole lot of risk for me. Um, that's not a great way to look at things if you're sort of outside of an internship opportunity. But some things I was looking at when I graduated, and it was like, should I go work at this startup? Because that was my first job outside of university was a startup. I was very hesitant. I know like the idea of a company having a lot of funding can be very appealing, right? Because like, hey, there's a lot of money that went into this company. It's like there's people that believe in it. They literally put millions of dollars into it. Like, how could it fail? Like, it seems exciting. That's a bit of an exaggeration. Obviously, there's a lot that can go wrong, but I think people get excited about that. And I was very much the opposite because I don't know what it was, but the thought of a lot of capital going into a company made me think like what are they doing with it? Like hopefully paying me, that's cool, but like it's a business. So like what are they doing with the money? And if they're not making money, like where does the money did we just keep getting money from investors? Like I don't know. It seems like a good deal for investors. Maybe I don't know if that's a good bet for me. Um and the other thing too is like I'm speaking in generalizations, right? Like I don't know if that means it's a good opportunity for me to, have a long-term growth plan at a company. Do they know what they're doing? Like they're getting money, that's cool, but do they know what they're doing? So for me, my first job outside of university was like, this is hopefully something long term. The thing that really was appealing to me was we don't have external investment and we're profitable. We have paying customers and we're profitable. So right away I was like, well, that's pretty cool. Like I don't feel like I need to worry. And the type of business it was in was like selling to law enforcement, government agencies. So I'm like, this feels pretty stable with respect to risk. So I guess one of the biases I have that I should have mentioned at the beginning of this is when it comes to taking risks, I personally feel like I'm pretty conservative. Um, I wish I wasn't so conservative about some options because I feel like that holds me back a lot. So um, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name or your handle incorrectly, but Swami, if that's correct, I think what I would recommend to you is depending on your risk appetite, I think when it comes to risks and startup, there is potentially significantly more risk with a given company, it's a startup. But depending on what's being offered there, that could be like significantly more rewarding financially, potentially, right? If you're having a lot of equity in that, it could be more rewarding. There's some other aspects I want to get into about startups and smaller companies, but you might find it more rewarding, but you have to be able to tolerate the risk profile. So that's the other thing, right? Like back to your question, if I were to leave Microsoft at some point, would I go back to a startup? Aside from it wanting like me wanting it to be my own company, I I think it would be very difficult at this point to like convince me like, hey, there's no or low risk to this because being so conservative in my current work, it would be very difficult to move me. The offer's got to be so appealing that I'm willing to take any amount of risk. So I do think when it comes to deciding about going to a startup, especially if you are, say, in big tech at Microsoft, um, your risk appetite needs to be you need to understand that. So understanding your own risk appetite and then going like, okay, well, what are the aspects of a company that I feel like I can de-risk, right? What are you willing to live with? So for example, I'll just make this up, right? If a company was like, say they got awesome technology, you really believe in it, you're passionate about it. Um, if you are, if they were like, hey, look, like we can't pay you for the first 6 months, would you automatically be like, well, no, I have to obviously have to pay a mortgage, like no thanks, like just feel over? Or would you be willing to say, look, I got money in savings, like I actually believe in this so much that I'm willing to kind of put that off? Like those are all types of things like I can't make that decision for you, but I really think that you need to like kind of evaluate that and what trade-offs you're willing to accept. So other way around, did you have any bias during your first job? You had an offer from Microsoft and startup would have been tough. Um, yeah, I think so. And I'll back up a little bit too, even for going for internships, right? I've said this publicly before. I was interested in working at startups during my internships because I felt like that's where I would be able to sort of like learn more and like I don't know, have more impact relative to what I was doing, if that makes sense. But I think if I applied, I don't think I applied to Microsoft, but say I applied to Microsoft and I applied to a bunch of startups and Microsoft offered, like I think at that time I probably would have just been like, yeah, Microsoft, like look, this is also why I'm trying to talk about this kind of stuff too, because I don't like I love working at Microsoft, so I'm not trying to speak ill of it, but I think that I wasn't putting a ton of thought into it. Like if that would have been an option, I probably just would have been like, people say this is it's the right thing to do. You go work at big tech, like you've, checked the box, you kind of accomplished the career stuff, but like it's just not reality. So I do, to answer your question, I do think I probably would have opted for Microsoft if I had the offer there. Um, but, but also, and if I maybe I'll kind of segue into some other topics, I want to talk about learning. I I genuinely don't think that I would have learned nearly as much if I started my career at Microsoft versus going to a startup. That's my opinion. And that doesn't mean because I think Microsoft is bad or Facebook or Meta or Amazon, whatever, right? I don't think big tech is bad or any specific company is bad. I actually don't like thinking about things as like strictly just good or bad. I kind of like thinking about, I don't know, like things on a spectrum and kind of understanding where they're at. But with respect to good and bad, I don't think that makes sense to say. But the learning opportunity at a startup is kind of ridiculous. if you're if you're at a if you're at a place that you feel, I want to use the word comfortable. And I say that because like you could be learning, hey, you're probably going to learn a lot no matter what at a startup. But if you're at a startup where like everything is going wrong and it's bad all the time, you're probably learning a whole bunch of stuff, but maybe it's all stuff you're like, I don't want to be doing this. Um, I do think that there are a lot of pieces or aspects to a startup that you end up learning where you might not want to learn about them, but they're incredibly valuable. And the example I want to give you is like, we talk about business value a lot, right? Especially in big tech, we're talking about driving impact for business value, right? So, like at Microsoft in particular, in terms of performance and promotions, like one big area that we get focus on is like how much business value are you delivering? What's your impact, right? It's not just, oh, did you like talk to this person and that person and they check a box? It's like, no, truly, like tell us about the impact, and then that will be a big weight in the decision making. So we talk about business impact a lot, but like, do people understand it? And I think at a startup, you're basically forced. You're depending how big or small it is, you're like almost forced to be exposed to that. So when a company is incredibly small and you're on the development team, it's a couple of people. There's a sales and a marketing team. Maybe it's one person, right? Like depending on the scope of it, you're around these other roles so much that you see how the business works. You don't know all the details. Like I've never sold anything at a digital forensics company. I've never done any marketing at a digital forensics company, but I've talked with these people a whole lot, especially in the very beginning and even as it's scaled, right? Like you keep those relationships. Um, but you learn so much about the other areas of the business. And that is like one foundational thing that I think personally, if I went into Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook right away, that probably just would have like been completely omitted. I shouldn't say complete, that's not fair, but I feel like it would have been lacking in comparison. And what was instilled in me from being at a startup, again, we like the startup I was at was profitable without investment. But we still like the way that I looked at it was still like we shouldn't be wasteful. Like it's not my money to waste. And I know that like we don't just have someone else's millions of dollars. So, we it was always like kind of thinking about how do we keep the business going? Like how do we keep moving it forward? And I don't feel like I would have had that instilled in me if it was like make if I don't do my work today, like Microsoft is gonna suffer. Like it's such a enormous entity that like me not doing that wouldn't have a significant impact. At a startup, it very well could. And that really kind of, I don't know, it was like motivating, it was aligned with how I like to work. Just going to check the comments here. Reviewing my subcontract as a software engineer, my lawyer keeps saying I have to minimize my scope. Um, so the lawyer keeps saying I have to minimize your scope. The company's four people, each person does everything. Not sure what does minimize the scope means. Um, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll start by saying that. And I've obviously not read your contract. Um, I think probably what this person's suggesting, and I don't know the context of why they're suggesting it in the first place, but just to answer your question, like what does minimize the scope mean? Kind of sounds like the opposite of what I'm trying to encourage or what happens at a startup. Is like, I mean, you kind of said it in your own comment. Everyone's doing everything. Like, I know what happens at startups. Like, that's the nature of it. So, um, yeah, like I don't know why they're suggesting that. Maybe it's because if your contract for work is suggesting you need to do these particular things, like you're almost overstepping what your contract is asking for. That's potentially what that's supposed to mean. Uh, which could be for a number of reasons. Maybe legally you're not supposed to be based on your contract, like you're actually overstepping by helping. And I don't know, I'm not a lawyer. Or maybe they're trying to suggest like you're doing more than you're getting paid for, and they're just trying to say like take your foot off the gas. You don't need to be doing that. So I don't know, but maybe that helps you think through it. So learning opportunities at startups, like I said, by being exposed to different roles and things like that, you have just a tremendous perspective that's kind of, I want to say, like forced upon you. It's not forced. It's just kind of like, part of being at a small company. You see these things. Um, we would do we would do like weekly town hall meetings, like weekly all hands, right? And we would talk about sales numbers and stuff like that. Like it doesn't affect me directly as I'm coding, right? That has nothing to do with the code that I'm writing, but it's cool to know that we're making things and we're seeing like kind of everything come together as a system. Like the sales and marketing team has to work to go sell the things that we're building. And like it just felt like a huge, I mean, it was a very tight knit team and it just kept growing, but we kept that culture. And I thought that was huge. So you get exposed to all these learning opportunities. But the other thing that I'll mention, and this is not, it's not big tech or a startup, but like you want to think about the types of like mentorship opportunities and who you can learn from. So one example, this like is in the favor of startups. One of the internships I had, one of the startups I applied for was founded by like ex Nvidia executives and like head engineers. And for me, I was like, that is so cool. Like these guys gotta be super smart. And surprised, they were ridiculously smart. So it was super cool to go to this company. And like the CEO was like a genius engineer. My manager had like multiple patents, was like a genius engineer. Like it was so cool to work under them and have like that technical support and sort of mentorship. So you can, depending on where you're applying to, you might really believe in the founder or like the team and stuff that's there. Um, and the reason I'm saying this is not like pro or con to big tech versus startup is like you can have the same type of thing at a big tech company, right? Like I'm a C sharp developer. There are lots of C sharp developers that I look up to that work at Microsoft. So that's really cool, right? They're not like directly on my team, but there's one in particular. I don't know. I don't want to like say people's names in case they care or whatever, but even for like a hobby project, I messaged them on Teams one day and was like, hey, like, I know this isn't work related and I don't want to bother you, but like, I know you're an expert in this. Like, what are your thoughts? And I was kind of just looking for a bit of feedback. And he wrote me this I'm never going to forget this. He wrote me this program. I've said this on another live stream or video that I've done. And the program that he sent me, I was like, I don't, I've been programming in C sharp for like 15 years now. And I was like, I can barely read this. Like, it's just so advanced. And I was like, this is the coolest thing, the coolest code that anyone's ever given me. So, learning opportunities again, like at big tech companies, there might be people that you really look up to there. So, it's not special to one or the other, but something that you can consider. Agree with you on the learning opportunities. I wouldn't say you don't have learning opportunities. Indeed, there are many, but learning opportunities are scoped to job functions. And startups, people are focused across job functions. 100%. That's 100% it. So again, if we take the big tech side, right? Like, I'll give you an example because I've just switched teams at Microsoft over the past the beginning of this year. So I still work within a part of Microsoft. It's called Substrate. So we have like the platform and infrastructure for all of the Office 365 services. Team that I was on for about 3 years was or 3.5 years, yeah, was called deployment. And we deployed basically every service that goes onto the machines in the data center. So from if I try to rewind my career, right? Like if I started in Microsoft and I started on the deployment team, I would have very specific knowledge about deployment technology for Microsoft, specifically with an Exchange or Substrate. Exchange is a really big part of Substrate. Um, so I would have that knowledge. And it's not that that's not valuable, right? Because if I like with all things, if we start to look at the abstractions of it, the like Zubin, who we interviewed on another podcast, uh, follow him on LinkedIn. I can't remember Pratt. I don't have pronounce his last name. Pratap. Amazing. He was talking about meta principles, but if you can extract some of these concepts and stuff from what you're doing, there's tons of lessons to learn. But Swami agreed with your comment. Like, it's a lot of what you're learning is scope to job function, and it just so happens that at startups, your job function is basically everything, or it's at least spread a lot more than you probably anticipate. So there is lots of learning at both, but it can look very different. And I think personally, the way my career has gone, I would not have, knowing what I know now, I would not have traded big tech in the beginning, at least for learning opportunities. Yeah, and I was very fortunate to work at startups that had no issue with risk and things like that. They were very successful. So that's been my experience. So I wouldn't recommend that to someone if their risk appetite was not there. But for if we factor that out and we're just looking at learning, I think that it was invaluable to be at a startup, personally. Okay, I want to talk about like levels and career progression because this one's kind of interesting. And I recently was talking about this and wrote about this where uh for a long time I just didn't think about it or care about it because it didn't matter. It didn't change anything about my life. So at startups, actually, let me back up. In big tech companies, like there's, if you haven't seen it yet, like there's a website called levels.fyi. I think a lot of people working in big tech know about this website. Basically, it has across all these big tech companies, here's like the levels they have, and here's the salary bands, and it's based on real data that people submit. It's like wildly accurate. And if you are looking at big tech companies going, well, I need to be at this level to make this much money, like it makes it much more motivating to be at a big tech company and be like, I'm at this level. What do I got to do to get to the next level? Because it's like, it's there. Like you have the information that's telling you, like, get to here and here's what happens. And I've noticed that, like, the focus on, I don't want to say like the focus on career progression is so much more in big tech, but I mean, like, the focus, it's like specifically on level progression because that's how career progression's quantitatively measured. That focus is very big, right? Because that is the measuring stick that tells us in big tech. Because once that level changes, then the other things happen. Like then the compensation goes up, these stock options, all this stuff. Like that changes as a result. So it makes, to me, it makes a ton of sense coming to Microsoft and seeing a lot of the motivation for levels. Like even my perspectives change where I'm like, I mean, that is the measuring stick. Of course, I'm going to align to that. But prior to Microsoft, so if I use magnet forensics as an example again, when I was there, especially, I don't even know for how many years, like we never had levels. It just wasn't a thing. You were just, for us, we had dedicated testers and we had software engineers. So you were like a tester or a developer, and that was it. Right. And like I never understood why people care about levels. Like, what does it matter? You do a good job at the end of the year. If you've done a good job, your pay goes up. Like that's that we have the one number and it's the pay. Like it goes up if you do good. Um, so I never got it, but it did make more sense, as time went by. It took me a long time to figure it out. Actually, like honestly, just prior to coming to Microsoft, like probably the last year and a bit, is when I really started to realize like, oh, people aren't staying here for life. They're not staying at Magnet Forensics for life. And what does that mean if they're coming here and going, thank you for the time at this company and I'm ready for the next one? If they were, I'm going to make some, roles up there, the principal or staff engineer or senior engineer somewhere, and they come to Magnet and then they're just developer, like, because there's no context. And then they want to go get another job. It almost looks like on paper it's backwards, but like there just was no levels. So we did introduce senior, and since I've been gone, there's other also I don't even know the levels now. I've seen people that work at Magnet that have staff in their title. So it sounds like they've done a much better job of like of building that. But that was just like a growing pain. It's not because someone sat there and they're like, we don't want levels, like the levels are bad. It was just like we don't know what to do for levels. We got to build them. There's no like cookie cutter apply the rules for. for levels, right? So I wanted to bring this up because if you're spending time in a startup, that may not be a factor for them. They might not be focused on, what does your career leveling system look like? Because they're probably focused on, how the heck do we keep this company afloat, get paying customers so that we're out of this mode of trying to like just survive. And that takes a long time. That can take years. Of course, if you have investment and stuff like that, that can look very different. I have not lived through that. I've never gone through a company that just had a ton of capital injection and they could start operating differently. That never happened for me. But that might be something you want to consider, right? I was personally not motivated by it, but I had never experienced the other side. So the question that was brought up in the chat, okay, after being in big tech, you go back to a startup. Well, I might have this in my mind. If it wasn't my own startup and I was just thinking about, going between companies, if I went from big tech to a startup and then I was like, okay, well, startup's not for me. I got to go back into big tech. I actually don't know how that might fit into like what my resume looks like in terms of levels. I would hope that a recruiter, a hiring manager wouldn't say, "Oh, went to a startup." Like, nope, probably not, but probably for myself, I might feel like, hey, like this, does this look like potentially a step back? Like it wasn't progressing my career. I don't know, but that is a potential gap. Of course, not every startup is this way. I'm obviously making huge generalizations, but having something like a career leveling guide is potentially not on the roadmap for some startups. Something to keep in mind. Okay, impact. We talked about impact a little bit because I was giving a bit of a comparison, but I found like this is something that I suspected and started my career off this way, and it certainly seemed to lend true, at least in my experience. So I mentioned earlier on the stream, right? Like I wanted to start with startups because in university for my internships, I wanted to feel like the impact I was having relative to the size of the company was tangible, right? Like companies 10 people, I'm 10% of the company, like my impact should be felt. So that's the experience that I wanted at a startup. And I think that's how it panned out. And so much so, like when I was working at Magnet Forensics, I felt like I got to have a tremendous amount of impact. That was actually something that probably changed how I work in general. Because I don't want to say I wasn't super motivated. I wasn't super motivated by work before that. But I think my manager, I guess the CTO, right? He he had a lot of trust in me, gave me a lot of runway to go do stuff and believed that I could do it. So I just kept doing it. And impact was felt like cool, like that was really good. Like keeps building the trust. And it for me, it was like a vicious cycle. I can keep you keep, kind of uh extending the the lead and like all of a sudden like you're not holding on to the leash anymore and I'm able to kind of do more and more and it just felt really rewarding and the impact was always very tangible in my opinion and I really appreciated that. So now big tech, here's the difference, like because impact can be looked at many different ways. I want to give you an example. I was talking about impact at a startup or a small company. I'm like, hey, I'm 10% of the company, my impact should be felt. I'm a very small fraction of what Microsoft is. I don't know what fraction of a percent I am, but it's small. But what's cool at working at some of these big tech companies, the scale, it's ridiculous. Like we're talking about a different type of impact altogether. So it's not necessarily like, I code something and Satya calls me up on Teams and he's like, awesome job. I can't believe you coded that. That's so cool. But that's the kind of impact I could have had at the smaller company where the CTO or the CEO, the founder, They see what you're doing, and that feels like really rewarding. But I'll give you an example. Like at Microsoft, it's like you go making some optimizations, and now you're saving millions of dollars per year, like or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, like depending on what it is. The the features that you're rolling out are going out to hundreds of millions of customers. So impact looks different, but impact also is not necessarily just quantitative in terms of scale, right? It's you have to figure out what kind of impact you are looking for to kind of gauge this. So I tried to give you a couple different examples there. One was like, how is my impact felt within the company? Kind of like who can recognize this work, right? The other was like, at scale in big tech, you can go do something and the impact is so huge because of the scale of the company, right? Whether that's features, saving money, more customers using it. So the scale of that impact is huge. But here's the other thing, and this is not necessarily tied to startups or big tech. It's just something to factor in when it comes to impact. This one is a little bit less quantitative, but arguably the most important. And I don't even know a good way to phrase this, but like who is feeling the impact and what is that impact on their life? So, to give you an example, I work in a routing team now. If anyone who's working in routing would be like, obviously, we want to reduce latency. But to give you an example, if we were to only reduce latency or we let latency slip on some requests by a millisecond or 2 milliseconds, like that has impact for us as a service. We don't want to do that, right? Or if our ability to route things drop from being like 3 or 4 or 5 nines accurate down to like it's only 99% accurate. So one out of every 100 requests you do, we drop. Like the impact on one user, like on one human, they're probably like, hey, what the heck happened? And then they do it again and it's fine, right? So the impact on a single user doesn't feel that meaningful. Obviously, it's scale. I'm not trying to minimize the value of that. But I'll give you the other example of being at the digital forensics company, because I think this one's going to be pretty obvious. The digital forensics company, we made digital forensic software. We didn't perform the investigations, but we sold it to law enforcement, government agencies, people doing investigations. And a lot of the time, the software was used to help catch pedophiles. Now, I don't know about you, but tell me one thing that's more rewarding than help put people like that away. And for me, that's a struggle because the impact of that work was so immense on that kind of level. It wasn't, millions of users, right? So that wasn't the factor. But knowing that I went through my career, and even if I helped save one child, like, was that worth 8 years of constantly working to save one child's life or to be part of that? Yeah, like absolutely it was. And the cool thing is that I know that I got to be part of helping more than that. I didn't do the work, but I contributed to it. And to me, that's a huge type of impact. So again, I don't think that you need to like pick between startups and big tech to find that impact, but I think that's a consideration. The whole framing of this, right, is like, hey, like if you're looking for a job, where should you go? Like I think you want to think about that. Where do you want to have an impact? Now, depending on your financial situation, some people might say like doesn't really matter right now. Like I'm looking for a job, and I understand that. You need to be in a place where you feel comfortable, right? You need to have your things paid for. You need to feel like steady state. But if that's something that you have, or you feel that you can get both, like the meaning behind your work, I think is really what's going to leave a lasting impression. Okay, just checking the chat. I've been in startups for 5 years, but I noticed the work gets to be too much and spread over different roles, and thus gets me shallow on most things instead of being focused. Yep, that can absolutely happen. Um, I don't know the startups you're at, so thank you for sharing this. I don't know the startups you're at, but this could be a growth challenge, right? Um, this even happens like even at Microsoft, the last team I was on, or the teams I was managing, like those people were getting spread too thin for sure. So it happens in big tech too, but it's like it can be like systematic in a startup, right? And that can feel very grueling. It can feel like there's no end to it. Like, it's one more project. Oh, like, just stay late for this one now and go help on these things. And like, it doesn't seem to end. So I get that. That can absolutely happen. But I kind of think that's a scaling problem because ideally, if those are problems that are repeating, then the company should be able to hire in roles to help for that. And I say that not like, hey, it's simple, just add more people. I know it's not that simple, but I think that that's part of it. There's it's either more people to help, which isn't just snap your fingers and more people show up. It could be the way that the work is split up and where the responsibilities lie. It could be a lot of factors, but then definitely get where you're coming from. I think that can be really draining. So it's not unique to startups, but certainly that kind of like startup grind. That's part of it. Uh, there's a Solana blockchain reference. I don't know. I stopped looking at crypto a long time ago, and I don't want to talk about it, so we're not going to. So yeah, impact can look different. But I guess my takeaway there was the meaning behind your impact can be the biggest impact on you. There you go. Something inspiring, right? Um, Maybe last thing I'll talk about is compensation. I got about 13 minutes left of like planned talking, but if there's still questions and stuff, I'll keep going. Happy to do that. Compensation. One of I should. This is a bias that I should have mentioned. I am from Canada. I'm currently living in the U.S. working for Microsoft. But when I was working in Canada, tech companies for me, at least in my experience, things were a lot more straightforward. It was like, here's your salary, your benefits, and potentially stock options depending on the company. Right? It was the focus was salary and benefits. Now, when you go applying for big tech, you'll see I mentioned levels.fyi earlier. If you're just joining the stream or whatever, you weren't paying attention, that's a site you can check out and you'll see like total compensation. And some of the numbers can be absolutely ridiculous. But this was a difference between the startups I was at and big tech. Because in big tech, when you're talking about total compensation, it's here's your salary. So I'm like, I understand what that number means. Here's what your benefits look like. And for me, that was a little bit weird just because it's Canada to the US. I'm like, I never had to worry about health insurance. I don't know what that means. But two common things. And then it was like signing bonus in cash. And I'm like, so I just start working for you and you just hand me cash. Like that wasn't a thing for me before. I didn't know what that meant. And the other part was the stock options. Now, stock options can look very different even across big tech companies. But one of the things I was mentioning earlier in the stream about taking risks with startups is like if they give you good equity and you believe in it and it is successful, I mean, it's pretty rare, right? It's not like lots of startups just become wildly successful or everyone would be doing it and there would be tons of really successful startups, but most of them fail. But, if you're at the right one, it can do really well. Ridiculous in terms of accuracy or simply are too much money. It's because it's three factors, and I didn't mention the third one yet. Is or maybe I just did. Yeah, stock options, salary, and my goodness, and cash signing bonus. So what it looks like when you see compensation, if I'm going to make up a number, right? If I was getting $100,000 a year in Canada and I had health or I had benefits, great. And then it's like, oh, when you get some stock options, but it's a startup, like they're not worth anything. What's it valued at? Who knows? But you get some shares, and then you go to a big tech company, and they're like, "Here's your salaries higher." And something I should call out too is the salary difference between Canada and the U.S. was incredibly different. But let's say it's the same. Okay, so here's $100,000 salary, but also here's $100,000 signing bonus. It's over 2 or 3 years, but here's $100,000. Now we've doubled it, and then here's $100,000 in stock. So the compensation is now $300,000. It's still $100,000 a year salary, and the other things are paid out over several years. But you see these compensation numbers that look ridiculous. That's what I meant by ridiculous. Is like they factor in all these things, and what I was used to seeing before was absolutely not that. The number you would see is your salary. So some of these things go up like 3x automatically just because of that kind of stuff. Um, do I know a good CPA helps Canada and US taxes? I do. I might have to follow up after the stream. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I do know one. I don't have anything left in Canada, so don't have to worry about that. Okay, compensation though, yeah. So the structure can look very different, and again, that's not to say that that kind of structure can't exist at startups, right? Especially if a startup has cash injected into it. They if they want to use that cash to attract talent and they want to compete with, like what big tech is offering, there are absolutely startups that will say, here's a really big salary because we know we have to compete. Our stock options, we don't know what those are really valued at, but here's a bunch and sign with us. So here's extra cash. So they can start to put together attractive opportunities. How to follow up with me after stream? I'm basically on every platform. If you're on X or Twitter or whatever they call it now, you can find me there, Dev Leader CA. Just shoot me a DM on the Twitter or Instagram. You can find me there. TikTok has messages. Yeah, basically anything. Look for Dev Leader. Shoot me a message. Tell me what your YouTube handle is so I know what the context of the conversation is, and then I'll message you back. Yeah, happy to help with that. So yeah, the compensation can look wildly different, and I think it's important to understand the structure of that, right? Because for me, going from a startup to big tech was like I was not familiar with that concept at all. So on paper, it looks ridiculous, as I said. But even when I was applying for jobs, it was like, I'm seeing offers from Amazon, and it's like I don't. How do I compare these job offers? So, someone's saying here's $500,000. Someone else is saying here's $100,000 more than that, and you're like, what? Like, where do these numbers even come from? So yeah, it was challenging for me, and I think that's important to look at and understand that. But the startup part in particular, going back to like stock options, like those could be worth a ton, or they could not be. That ties back to risk that we talked about in the beginning. You could be taking huge risk on that, but um, I was fortunate in my case, right? It wasn't a matter of like I felt like the entire like from the day I took the interview and walked through the office and they offered me, I was like, I wasn't like, oh, this company is gonna be the next thing since sliced bread. It was more like, I know this company's not gonna fail. I know that. I'm confident. And then as time went on, it was like the more the more we put into it, the better it does. Like I felt like I had ownership of the company. And I don't mean like I owned it. I mean like I felt like I had partial ownership. I technically did. I had stock in it. But I could put more effort in and better things would happen. So it was super motivating to do so. Now, that company did go public. They went public after I left. Maybe bad timing. They also got bought back to private for I think 1.8 billion dollars Canadian. So financially, I might not have done the right thing, but there's an example of a startup that did very well, right? It's not common that startups have success or wild success like that. So, part of my bias, I was at a very good startup, great culture. And maybe in the last couple minutes, that's another thing to touch on is culture. I didn't write that in my notes, but I think that's an important one. I think that sometimes people perceive like startups have like a scrappy, we're family kind of culture. My bias is that's how it felt. That's just how it felt at the startups I was at, and it was good. It didn't feel artificial for me. And I think the other maybe perception that people have is like big tech cannot feel like that. It's too big. There were big, the teams. There's so many teams doing different things. Like, how could it possibly have good culture like that? But um, I can confident. Like, I was actually worried about this coming to Microsoft, and for transparency, I was looking at Amazon offers from Amazon and Microsoft, and having worked at neither, I'm just going by what I was able to gather. And I had heard people saying like, I heard a bunch of stuff that wasn't great about Amazon culture. And since then, I've heard lots of people saying it's been great. So I think it's situational. But I didn't hear a single person saying Microsoft culture has not been good to work there. I think historically, going back maybe 10 years or something, it might not have been great. Any piece of data that I could collect was just like Microsoft culture is so good. I was like, okay, like I want to lean into the culture a little bit more. And sure enough, like not disappointed. Something I always share with people is you'll see like Microsoft talking about being inclusive and valuing diversity. And if you're on the outside, some people might go, "Oh, that's just a big company doing what they got to do." But like, it's it's a real big thing internally. So what's really cool to see is different levels of leadership and management. Like that is a factor. It's not just something that they stamp and make a post about it on Facebook or something. It's like that's part of our identity, and it's really cool. So much so that it goes into the performance reviews and stuff like that. There's literally aspects of having like diverse and inclusive culture included in that. So I think that's super cool. Um, even I'll give you another example, and this is maybe a little. It's not so much like big tech versus startups. Like something that changed for me going from startups to big tech was like this was right around the time where like during the pandemic. I don't know if I can say pandemic and my stream is gonna like get taken offline or something, but um a lot of like remote work just like became a thing right away. I went from switching jobs where everything was in office, open concept to everyone's remote. The previous team I was on, my entire team worked remotely. I lived not far from the office, but it didn't make sense for me to go there because I would go to the office and then jump on Teams and be on calls. And on this new team I'm on, there are a lot of people that go into the office. And like it's like a hybrid thing, right? They're not just like in the office, but a lot of people will go in on certain days and stuff. And I don't know, like I think that's part of the culture change between the teams. Because I think there is a lot of value in seeing people in person. I am very much like pro work from home, but I do value seeing people face to face if we can do it. So uh, the culture on this team feels very much more I don't know, like not it's not quite like we're family like the startup days because that's a really hard thing to replicate, I think, but it just feels more closely knit. Um, so I don't know if that's from being more in office with this team. There are people that are I work with. One of my product managers works remotely. Can't speak. Works remotely from me, and I collaborate with him a ton. And I feel like we have each other's backs, and like that's like a really cool feeling to have on a team. So I don't think it's totally in person stuff, but where I'm getting at with this tangent is like the culture. You can still have a really cool team culture. It's very collaborative, very supportive, even in big tech. Um, kind of to use one of the examples from the chat earlier, like this can be something that's team dependent, right? Organization dependent. And in startups, like not many teams, like, you kind of have that culture, you're all working together. Or sometimes not. Maybe you're at a startup and like the culture's kind of crappy, and that's probably a good sign. It's not probably not going too far. The culture's already kind of crappy to begin with. But in big tech, with so many teams, you might have pockets of teams that are maybe not gelling so well for any different reasons, right? And you might have some teams that are just very closely knit. There's more diversity in the types of teams that you're going to see. So, um, something to factor in. But culture will look different. It's just not that like one of them is mutually exclusive. Like only startups can be close knit, and big tech must be, not tightly knit teams. Um, there's just more variety in big tech. You might have some teams that are not. But I think that's it. That's kind of my rundown of startups versus big tech from my experience. If you have watched this and you're still going, well, Nick, which one do I go apply to? Told you at the beginning that wasn't the goal to convince you about either. I I wanted to give you some things to think about to do your own analysis because I think that's important. I think you have to find the type of thing you want to do and work. And yeah, I hope that was some amount of insight that helps. So let me know. If you have thoughts about other topics you want to see in the next live stream, so I'll be doing that on next Monday. You can drop those in the chat. Happy to follow up with those. Like I've said before, like I do these because I want to share experiences and stuff with you guys. So um, if you have topics, it makes sense for me to talk about them. Actually, even this one came up from people asking me questions. So, I'm happy to kind of steer the content for what you want. So thanks so much for watching. If you want to learn C sharp, I got courses on Dome Train for that. Um, this is on a whole bunch of different platforms as well, by the way. So if you're watching on a platform because you happen to see it, but it's not your preferred platform, this is literally on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitch, X, Instagram, Facebook. I couldn't do TikTok because apparently I need 1,000 followers on TikTok. So if you want to follow me on TikTok so I can live stream there, that would be cool. But I thank you for all your support, and I will see you next week, I hope. So take care and enjoy the rest of your week.